Hello my friends, welcome back to another episode of Garhdo Goes Geek. On today's episode, as this year, I meant to get this out a bit earlier for the actual anniversary, but this year is the 30th anniversary of X-Men, the animated series, released in November 1992 with its first couple of episodes. And as a result, I thought I'd look back on the entire show and discuss why I think it is possibly the best X-Men adaptation. Stick around, it's going to be a good one. So, I think everyone has probably heard of the X-Men. The X-Men were at one point one of the biggest names in comics. Like, at one point it was reported in, I believe, the late 80s, early 90s, that the entire X-Men line of comics, so literally anything with an X on the title, if you took the sales from those comics alone and weighed them up against the rest of Marvel and the entirety of DC Comics, the X-Men were outselling both combined. So this gives you an idea of how big the X-Men were. X-Men is huge. It has been huge for a long time. But it's not always been huge. The X-Men was originally created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, two of the founders of Marvel Comics, who created them in 1963. So I will be commenting on X-Men again in 2023 for their 60th anniversary. And the X-Men, while a lot of people have attributed quotes to Stan Lee, saying he created them as an allegory, saying he created them as a reference to civil rights, and some element of that may be true. Stan Lee is, he was a very clever man in terms of constructing a narrative. There's a quote that he's said quite a lot when discussing Spider-Man, which is, "I've told this story so often it might even be true." And I think that quote sums up Stan Lee perfectly. He has a habit of changing the narrative on his own things. It's one of many mixed issues about the man that means that I could never make a concrete opinion on my thoughts about him. But regardless of that, lots of people will attribute quotes that he said about the X-Men, about how they were an allegory for civil rights, how it was a reference, Charles Xavier was a reference to Martin Luther King, Magneto was a reference to Malcolm X with his more violent means of, trying to promote equality. But essentially, the one thing that pretty much everyone can agree on was that the X-Men, or the mutants, as they were originally called by Stan Lee, were born out of laziness. By 1963, Marvel had created a lot of heroes and a lot of villains. That's the more interesting one. Obviously, heroes, you create them, they anchor a title, they carry on. And so Marvel heroes that Stan Lee had created in this time period already included Spider-Man, Thor, Ant-Man, the Wasp, Iron Man, Daredevil, I think, had already debuted by this point. Some of the other Avengers, the Fantastic Four. When I say Avengers, I'm talking characters like Hawkeye, I think, had appeared by this point as well. The Hulk. There'd been a lot of main heroes. But all of those heroes had an array of villains. Like, by the time the X-Men debuted, I think pretty much all of the main members of the Sinister Six had appeared in Spider-Man. So that was Dr. Octopus, the Sandman, Kraven the Hunter, the Chameleon, the Vulture, Mysterio, and then that's just, the Spider-Man villains. There's also the Green Goblin, I think, had appeared by this point. Going through the Avengers, you had Kang the Conqueror, you had, who I believe had appeared by this point, Baron Zemo. Captain America and Submariner had been reintroduced from the Golden Age. The Fantastic Four had fought many of their biggest villains by this point, including Doctor Doom, the Mole Man. And so, essentially, what everyone forgets about comic books is, yes, you create the heroes, but you also have to create the villains. And if you create the villains, and they'll fight, like I said, the characters will fight different villains every issue. And some of them may reappear, but, for the most part, it's a different villain every issue. And so you have to create way more villains than you do heroes. And the thing with that is, all of those villains need powers, need origin stories, in exactly the same way as the heroes. We need to know who these characters are, how they got their fantastic abilities. And so the X-Men were born from laziness, because Stan Lee's big idea with the X-Men was, we'll just say they're born with their powers, and they develop them at puberty. Brilliant! Because you can give characters now whatever powers you want, and just say they're born with them. And the way you explain that they're born with them, it's mutation, it's evolution, it's a natural evolution of humanity. And so was born the X-Men, and their main antagonist, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, led by Magneto and featuring the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver and several other characters that would go on to be huge names. So yeah, it was because Stan Lee was getting sick of coming up with origin stories that we got the X-Men. Now, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby didn't stay on the X-Men comics for very long compared to some of the other titles they were writing at the time. Stan Lee stayed with the Avengers for a while. He stayed with the Fantastic Four for a while. He stayed with Spider-Man for a while. In fact, Stan and Jack worked together on the Fantastic Four, and Stan Lee and Steve Ditko worked together on Spider-Man and also Doctor Strange. But with the X-Men, both of them left the title in fairly short order. I think they both left by the end of the first year, or definitely by the end of the second. X-Men was published bi-monthly, so it was every 2 months that an issue of X-Men would come out, and Avengers launched at the same time. In fact, in the same month, September 1963, you saw the launch of the Avengers title as well. And Stan sort of stayed on Avengers and left X-Men, and so other people took over X-Men. But X-Men, at least the original team of X-Men, consisting of Cyclops, Jean Grey, who was called Marvel Girl at the time, Iceman, Angel, and Beast, led by Professor Xavier, never really took off. It didn't become this huge household name. In fact, by the time of its 60th issue, the writing was on the wall, and X-Men was going to be cancelled. I think it was actually cancelled with issue 63, 64. May even been 66. Anyway, around about that point, X-Men was cancelled. And the title was kept, but it entered reprints. So each of the titles was now reprinting stories from earlier. This was the early 70s, and by this point, Marvel was big and interconnected, and the X-Men had appeared in other titles. They'd crossed over with the Avengers, they'd crossed over with the Defenders as well, not the street level heroes that the Defenders is currently known as, but Doctor Strange and the Silver Surfer's group. They were well-established characters in the universe, but they now joined a group of characters like the Inhumans, for example, or the Black Panther, who were characters that existed in the universe but didn't really have their own title, because their title was now no longer printing new stories about them, it was printing reprints of their early adventures. And it was fair enough, it's fine, this is what happens in comics. Then a decision was made to relaunch the X-Men, to sort of go back to basics on it. And that led to 1975's Giant Size X-Men issue 1. Giant Size X-Men 1 is a special which focuses on the original members of the team being captured by a walking island called Krakoa. And all of them are held there except for Cyclops, who manages to escape. Cyclops and Professor Xavier then gather a brand new team of X-Men, featuring characters from across the world. So we had the Russian super strong mutant Colossus, the African weather witch Storm, the teleporting demon Nightcrawler from Germany, the Irish Banshee, the Japanese Sunfire, and perhaps the character that would become the X-Men's most famous member, the Canadian super soldier Wolverine. And this team of mutants was the one now sent to rescue the original X-Men from Krakoa. And what follows is a very well written, very, very fun adventure, written by Len Wein, drawn by Dave Cockrum. And it became a smash hit. It revitalised the team, and soon the decision was made to progress from that in the in the pages of the X-Men title, to cancel the reprints and start printing new comics. And Len Wein, I think, turned down the job as regular writer, and so Chris Claremont took over and began what became I believe it was 17-year run as the flagship writer of X-Men. And I'm not sure if that record has ever been broken. Like, this man wrote the same comic for 17 years, and when recommending comics to people, a lot of people will recommend the occasional classic story, but if you're tending to recommend people ongoing comics, you tend to recommend a more recent story. Say, oh, start here, it's only a couple of years old, and then you can, work from there into the modern stuff. With X-Men, that has always been my exception. I always recommend starting at Giant Size X-Men 1 and then reading from there into the X-Men, or the Uncanny X-Men as the title soon got renamed, because Claremont's stuff with both Dave Cockrum and then later John Byrne forms the backbone of what the X-Men are. He takes everything that was established in the early the 60s stories, these gathering of mutants sworn to protect a world that hates and fears them, as they deal with racism from humans, they deal with their own evil counterparts. Chris Claremont took all of that with Cockrum and Byrne and reframed it and launched this era of unparalleled creativity, where so much was created and added to the mythos of the X-Men, to the point that the X-Men have their own allegories for pretty much every major thing in the Marvel Universe. There are magic items associated purely with the X-Men. There are alien races associated purely with the X-Men. There are time travel stories and science fiction stories associated purely with the X-Men, as opposed to the rest of the Marvel Universe. You know, the Fantastic Four had the Skrulls, the Avengers had the Kree, 1971 saw the Kree-Skrull War in the issues of Avengers, where all these concepts came together. The X-Men introduced the Shi'ar Empire, and the Starjammers, which were the Guardians of the Galaxy before the Guardians of the Galaxy were even a thing. They introduced the Savage Land, which was a land in Antarctica where dinosaurs still roamed the Earth in a tropical paradise, alongside cavemen. They introduced magical items like Limbo and the Siege Perilous and demons, literal demons, that led to a story arc called Inferno, where demons took over Manhattan. A line-wide crossover event that affected every title for every character set in New York. So it affected Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four. Like, in the Fantastic Four, Johnny couldn't turn off his flame when Limbo invaded Earth, because it's fire. It's so good and so clever, and this led to such huge success. Like I said, the X-Men were leading crossovers that were affecting the Marvel Universe. Inferno, as much as it affected all these other characters, it was an X-Men story. If you wanted to know why there were demons in New York, you had to read the X-Men titles to understand Inferno. So that was X-Men, X-Factor, and New Mutants. If you didn't read those, you had no idea what was going on. You had no idea why this was even a thing. Why were there demons in New York? And that story was in the mid-80s. By that point, the X-Men train had left the station and it was rocketing full speed down the line. They were heading off to unparalleled levels of success. They launched a line of X-Men action figures based purely on the sales of these comics. No cartoon series, no film series, nothing. Just the comics. And it sold to kids. Kids bought these, action figures. Fun story, the Toy Biz managed to argue successfully in court that the X-Men weren't human and therefore they wouldn't have to pay the higher tax for humanoid figures. Bet the makers of Teenage Mutant Turtles wish they'd thought of that one. It was great. X-Men was amazing. So many great characters that are still known and beloved got introduced during this time. Rogue, Gambit, Kitty Pryde, Emma Frost, Mr. Sinister, Apocalypse, Magic, Cannonball. So many great characters introduced under Claremont's guidance and the team that he built up around him to help write these titles. Specifically Louise Simonson, who wrote a lot of New Mutants, and X-Factor, and yeah, like I said, X-Men was fantastic. I love it. The X-Men is one of my favourite comic books ever. It's always been one of the things that I've loved and adored. It's so much fun, and the characters are great. These are characters who bicker and fight, and so much of their character drama comes from their interactions with each other. You only have to look at one of the central relationships, which is essentially a love triangle between Wolverine, Cyclops, and Jean Grey. Where Jean is drawn to both of them, and they're both drawn to her. It's so clever. I love it. And yeah. Eventually, Claremont left the title, but by that point, X-Men was a huge success. The second X-Men title that launched in the 90s, the first issue of it holds the Guinness World Record for the best-selling issue of a comic book. It sold 8 million copies. Now, part of that was due to the Spectator boom in the early, the late 80s and early 90s. This issue had multiple variant covers, which meant that some people were buying 5 issues of the same comic, 5 issues of the same comic. 5 issues. Yeah, you know what I mean. And it's not a bad idea, not terrible. But, it was a good title regardless. Like, the actual first issue was good, and it led to Claremont's last story arc, which was X-Men Volume 2, Issue 1, 2, and 3, which saw all of the 90s X-Men team, which at that point had been divided into Team Blue and Team Gold, and he was working with Jim Lee, who would go on to become one of the major heads at DC Comics, and one of the founders of Image. And yeah, it was a decent story, a nice, decent story with them and Magneto. And from there, other people would eventually take over, and that was roughly when I began reading X-Men. I began reading X-Men in the early 90s because I grew up in the UK, and Panini Comics started publishing collector's editions, as they were labeling them over here, collecting the Spider-Man Clone Saga and X-Men from just before the Fatal Attraction story, which was a 1993 crossover for the 30th anniversary of the X-Men, featuring them versus Magneto. And, these started in sort of 1995, so that was when I started reading these characters. And yeah, they were good. I enjoyed them. I collected Essential X-Men, as it was called over here, for years. And I've read so many great stories as part of it. As much as everyone goes on about 90s comic excess, and there was plenty of it, there's plenty of 90s comics that have aged like milk. X-Men is one that I will stand up for. It holds a special place in my heart, and there is a lot of good stuff in there. And of course, by this point, X-Men had moved into films and television. We had a Generation X TV movie based on the new title. There were plans to do an X-Men film, and we had X-Men the Animated Series. So, how does X-Men the Animated Series adapt what by that point was 30 years of X-Men comics?
Previously on X-Men.
Now, X-Men the Animated Series was actually the second attempt to bring the X-Men to cartoons. The first was a television pilot broadcast in 1989, which is commonly referred to as Pride of the X-Men. It wasn't picked up, but it did form the basis for the Konami X-Men arcade game. It features a team of Cyclops, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Storm, Dazzler, and Wolverine, and adds Kitty Pryde as the sort of the audience surrogate character being introduced to the team. It's specifically influenced by a lot of issues around the Dark Phoenix saga, so sort of issues 129 to 139 of Uncanny X-Men, that introduced Kitty Pryde and sort of brought her onto the team. Those issues also introduced the Dazzler, actually, thinking about it. But Marvel started having financial issues not long after the pilot was delivered, and so the pilot was never picked up, and it actually marked the end of the first Marvel animated universe, which had been created by DeBatty Enterprises, which had the 1978 Fantastic Four series, the 1979 Spider-Woman series, Spider-Man and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends from 1981, and The Incredible Hulk from 1982. The X-Men itself even guest starred in episodes of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, although that wasn't technically in the same continuity. Pride of the X-Men was more notable for having Stan Lee actually narrate it, and it's quite meme-worthy due to its very, very 80s theme song, for lack of a better term. X-Men the Animated Series, though, was picked up by Margaret Loesch, who was head of Fox's Children Network. She had been one of the champions of the Pride of the X-Men pilot, and so she was quite quick when she got the role as becoming head of Fox's Children in 1991 to set up an order for 13 episodes of X-Men. The producer of the series was Saban Entertainment, who would later be known for their work with Power Rangers, and they hired a studio called Gratz Entertainment to produce the episodes, as they didn't have enough staff to handle production in-house. Gratz was the one that employed the creative staff. They wrote and designed each episode. They drew the storyboards. They did the voice work in Canada, and they did the animation in South Korea with the studio ACOM. Now, the original pilot, Night of the Sentinels, was a bit muddled. It turned it up late from ACOM. It had animation errors that they refused to fix because they didn't have the time. And so it was originally aired as kind of like a sneak preview, with scenes missing and only like a day to edit it. All these errors were corrected in subsequent re-airings in 1993, because Fox threatened to remove ACOM's contracts because of all the delays and errors. The series aired mainly through 1993. The first 13 episodes, it's earned top ratings throughout the season. It then got renewed for a second season of 13 episodes. And there were plenty of quality control issues. There were attempts to cut costs, requests to change the tone of the series to something more child-friendly and to incorporate some of the toys that were being sold. But, the producers had a vision for this show, and they generally stuck to it. The series was planned for 65 episodes. This was eventually extended, although with a much reduced budget due to Marvel's bankruptcy that was happening at around the same time. That is a story I will discuss at some point because it's one of the more interesting stories in nerd culture. And so another couple of animation studios were brought in for the final episodes, and some of the final episodes that were developed were actually episodes that had been scrapped earlier on. They were just sort of tightened up and finished. So yeah, X-Men was very successful. It hit really good ratings for a animated series, especially a Saturday morning animated series. It the success that it had was what led to Power Rangers, which was the next series that Saban was trying to sell to Fox. It led to an entire line of animated Marvel television. So the Iron Man and Fantastic Four series as part of the Marvel Action Hour soon followed. So did Incredible Hulk, which later added She-Hulk to the roster. And most notably, the Spider-Man 90s television series, which again went on to huge critical acclaim. And is, again, generally considered one of the best adaptations of the character. Now, X-Men centered itself around a core cast of 9, which is quite a large cast for an animated series. The characters were based on the 90s designs of the X-Men drawn by Jim Lee, specifically the Blue Team. A lot of the members of this comprise members of the Blue Team rather than the Gold Team. So you have Cyclops, Wolverine, Rogue, Storm, Beast, Gambit, Jubilee, Jean Grey, and Professor Xavier. And this is a good team of characters. There's an even gender balance, which, with the exception of Xavier, between the team members, which is really good to see. Jubilee becomes the audience surrogate. There's romantic tension between characters like Gambit and Rogue. There's, all sorts of dramatic tension between characters like Cyclops and Wolverine, and also Cyclops and Gambit as well. But, there's also elements of genuine friendship and mentorship between, especially around the characters like Storm and Beast, and Jean Grey as well. So there's a lot of really interesting character dynamics that are built relatively quickly, actually. Even in the first pilot episode, Night of the Sentinels, which is a two-parter, it builds up these characters very, very well. It introduces another character as well, who was an original character adapted from a previous X-Men, who is Morph. He is an adaptation of the X-Men comics character Changeling. Now, Morph was originally introduced purely to die. The Night of the Sentinels opening sees the idea of the Mutant Registration Act, which is something that was used in Days of Future Past, one of the most famous X-Men stories created by Claremont and Byrne. It's essentially, there is a register of mutants, and that is being used by the Mutant Control Agency, I believe they're called, to round up mutants using the giant robots, Sentinels. Now, the Sentinels are goofy, but I love them. They were very much a Jack Kirby creation. These giant sort of mauve and blue robots. It's the same colour combination that's used for Galactus later on as well, which is even more bizarre to me. But yeah, these giant robots, because they are ridiculously tall. They're about 30 foot tall, but humanoid. and yet they fly and they have laser blasters in their hands, and yeah, and their job is to round up and battle mutants. And yeah, Jubilee is registered by her foster parents because she's a mutant, and so the Sentinels then come for her. They attack her in her home. They attack her in the mall. She ends up running across the X-Men, who are also in the mall. They save her. They take her back. The X-Men learn the link between the Mutant Control Agency and the Sentinels. They then decide to strike at the Control Agency to destroy the the data that they have there. And as part of the mission, they get ambushed by Sentinels. Morph is blasted and seemingly left for dead because the rest of the X-Men have to evacuate, and Beast is also left behind. Beast is then arrested and spends the rest of the first season in prison. You know, just deciding that he wants his day in court. He wants to argue his case because Beast is especially clever and erudite and realizes that's important. And I think this is such a good introduction because it puts front and center the conflict between mutants and humans. Not heroic mutants versus evil mutants, which you have with anything that adapts Magneto as the first X-Men, the first villain that the X-Men face. Looking at you, 2000 movie. No, the focus here is on the humans and how humans react to mutants, because that is one of the core tenets of the comics that especially Chris Claremont focused on, and to me is fantastic. The X-Men are outsiders because they're mutants. That's what's interesting. And so yeah, I really like this this story and how it introduces the concepts and the characters, and the action of leaving Morph and Beast behind causes drama. Wolverine punches Cyclops in the gut over it. You know, there's a huge rift in the team that forms almost from this very first episode. It's fantastic. It's really well done. It works really well as a pilot to introduce these characters and these concepts. And then the series builds from that really quickly. You know, the first season then introduces Magneto. You know, using a lot of elements of the very first story featuring Magneto and the X-Men from X-Men issue 1. You know, he tries to free Beast from prison, and you know, we reveal that he and Xavier are former friends, which is something that I believe was added by Claremont, and or at least was developed more by Claremont, and was also one of the other aspects they reveal is that Magneto survived a genocide. They don't explicitly call it a genocide. This is still a kids' cartoon, and they do not make out that it's the Holocaust, but they imply that yeah, Magneto lost his family. You know, he lost his family during a racial conflict, and that's what motivated him to be Magneto. And this is everything that was added to the comics by Claremont. This was added in the 70s and the 80s to kind of humanize Magneto, to explain why he is the way that he is. And I love it. And I love that, you know, because this series has all this continuity that it can play with, it's able to take bits from the entirety of X-Men history at that point and use it. We also start seeing the introductions of some more recent elements of the comics. We see the Morlocks who kidnap Cyclops, and, you know, it's Callisto, the leader of the Morlocks. The Morlocks are an underground group of mutants that live in the sewers underneath New York City, believing that they're that they should hide themselves from the rest of humanity because they're of their mutations. They try to kidnap Cyclops, and Cyclops is saved by, Wolverine and Jean and Storm, and it's Wolverine seeing Jean and Scott together, then takes a leave of absence, which then leads to him encountering Sabretooth and explores their relationship. Meanwhile, some of the other mutants, so I believe it's Gambit, Storm, and Jubilee, go to Genosha, which is a concept that was introduced by Chris Claremont and Rick Leonardi and Mark Silvestri, I believe, which had it's essentially an island that's built on a mutant slave class. Now, it is retooled in this. They're not genetically engineered enslaved mutants like they are in the comics, which are the mutates. Instead, they are captured mutants. And so this also sees the introduction of some characters that would recur throughout the series. So Sunfire, the Blob, North Star, and a few others appear as captive mutants on Genosha, sort of lured in by this idea of a mutant human paradise and then captured by Sentinels. This episode also sees the introduction of Cable, who was a very relatively recent addition to the comics at the time and would later be revealed to be the time-lost son of Cyclops and a clone of Jean Grey called Madeline Pryor, because comics are weird, and the X-Men comics are weirder still. But Cable is essentially a time-travelling soldier who helps, he's wearing X symbols, but also turns up to occasionally fight, injustice. So he fights the Genosian leadership. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, there is a subplot with Senator Robert Kelly, who is now campaigning for president, and he wants to see mutants removed. This then builds up with some of the other characters like Bolivar Trask, the creator of the Sentinels, and Henry Peter Gyrich, a government agent who's working with Trask, and how they're dealing with the mutant problem, what their approach is to it. And it's revealed that Sentinels are being manufactured by a giant Sentinel called the Master Mold, who has plans of its own. We then see the introduction of Apocalypse, one of a character introduced in the 80s by Louise Simonson in X Factor. She is, that was I'm thinking of the writer. Apocalypse in this is incredible. He's voiced by John Colicos, who played the character of Kor in Star Trek and went on to have roles in Battlestar Galactica and a few other things. He's amazing as the voice of Apocalypse. He's got a real gravitas to his voice, proper Shakespearean tone. We even get an adaptation in the first season of the 2-part episode Days of Future Past, inspired very loosely by the original Days of Future Past storyline, because it's trying to fit the adaptation of, it's trying to fit the continuity that's already been established by this show. So, you still have this desolate future where the Sentinels rule and Wolverine is leading a resistance. However, rather than using the character of Kitty Pryde as the time traveller, they use the character of Bishop. Now, Bishop was, again, another recent addition to the comics at the time, a very popular addition, a mutant police officer from the future who was essentially, rounding up other mutants. He was fighting other mutants. And that's essentially what he's doing here. He's doing this for the Sentinels. And he comes back in time because he believes someone is going to betray the X-Men and kill Robert Kelly. And that's what causes his dark future. You know, because he teams up with Wolverine and Forge, who is actually introduced in this story. His present-day version is introduced later on in the cartoon. And, yeah, Bishop then teams up with the X-Men, and they try and stop Kelly's assassination, which is being performed by Mystique, disguised as Gambit, because one of the recurring elements of Bishop's story is he thought that Gambit was a traitor to the X-Men, because in his timeline, Gambit is left as the last witness of the X-Men's downfall. You know, Bishop thinks that he's the one that betrayed the X-Men because he's the only survivor of the X-Men. Turned out not to be the case in the comics, but that's a different story. But yeah, the Brotherhood of Mutants, led by Mystique, tried to assassinate Robert Kelly. The X-Men managed to save him, however, Kelly is then abducted, and this leads then into the final episode, The Final Decision, where it's revealed that Magneto has abducted Kelly, and Master Mold then rescues Kelly using the Sentinels from Magneto, leading to Magneto teaming up with the X-Men to stop the Sentinels, because Master Mold is trying to force Trask to do his bidding and put computers, essentially, in the brains of Kelly and other world leaders to make them malleable. And, you know, what follows is this epic final battle as all the members of the X-Men and Magneto team up, stop the Sentinels. It's fantastic. It's brilliant to see the X-Men cut loose, especially, for example, characters like Wolverine. Wolverine's weapons are lethal. His claws are lethal. So, of course, he doesn't tend to use them a lot in the cartoon, and if he does, the lethality is toned right down. However, when he uses them against the Sentinels, he gets to tear Sentinels apart. And so this is a lot of fun. And this is just the first season. This is just the first 13 episodes. And there's other stuff in here as well. There's an introduction to the Juggernaut. There's an adaptation of Rogue's origins. You know, the story with Apocalypse's introduction features Rogue trying to take a mutant cure, because Apocalypse and Mystique are posing as... You know, Mystique is working with Apocalypse, posing as a scientist who says she has a cure for mutancy. And so Rogue tries to take the cure, but also trying to take the cure is Angel. And Mystique, being protective towards Rogue, because it's later revealed that, you know, she's Rogue's foster mother, manages to discourage Rogue away, but Angel is then taken by Apocalypse and transformed, along with 3 other mutants, into one of his horsemen, becoming Archangel, this metal-winged version of the character. And Apocalypse uses Angel and, you know, Archangel and his horsemen to attack the world. And then the X-Men manage to stop him in a fight in Stonehenge, and it's with Rogue's help that Archangel manages to get his mind back and fight against Apocalypse. And, you know, that's just part of it. You know, these first 13 episodes are tight, and every episode starts with previously on X-Men, catching you up with what has gone on, what the relevant plot threads for this episode are. It's brilliant. Revolutionizes, you know, children's storytelling and animated storytelling for kids by addressing all of this stuff in a mature way. It takes everything that everyone loved about these comics, the reason these comics were so successful, not just with kids, but with adults as well, and puts it front and centre. And for me, that is why it's so good. And like I said, that's just season 1. It gets so much better from there. You know, season 2 is also serialized. It features an ongoing subplot where Magneto and Xavier are lured to the Savage Land by Morph, who turns out to still be alive. And, Morph tries to enact his revenge on the X-Men, manipulated to do so by Mr. Sinister. Mr. Sinister is one of my favourite X-Men villains. He is so fun. So fun. He's camp and evil and manipulative and so clever and arrogant, and I love him. He's sublime, and having him in this is brilliant, and he becomes the main recurring villain for season 2 in the same way that the Sentinels were for season 1. And again, Magneto takes on this not quite heroic, not quite villainous role that he did in season 1. Because, Magneto has elements of being right. And there's a lot more original concepts in season 2 than there is in season 1. Season 1 is very much adapting some of the greatest hits of the X-Men comics. Whereas season 2 is doing some more original ideas, but still doing some social commentary. Like, there's still things like they bring Bishop back, and they do essentially an adaptation of the relatively new to the comics Legacy Virus storyline, which was born out of the 1992 crossover Executioner's song. The Legacy Virus storyline was essentially a commentary on the AIDS crisis and, the sort of paranoia that went along with that. And the Time Fugitives two-parter features an adaptation almost of that storyline and some of those elements. Season 2 also introduces the Friends of Humanity, which is a much more violent anti-mutant group, essentially like an alt-right grassroots group, led by Graydon Creed, who is later revealed to be the secret son of Sabretooth. His father is a mutant. It's also even later revealed that his mother is Mystique, so he is the human child of 2 mutant supervillains. And, the rest of his group turn on him when they learn this. But yet, Graydon Creed, again, one of my favourite villains in the X-Men comics. The dude is evil, and like a very relatable kind of evil, especially in the modern day, especially in modern America. Graydon Creed is a character that fits perfectly alongside, trash like Ben Shapiro and Donald Trump and Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, these Matt Walsh, these horrible, horrible people victimizing so many others just because they can, just because they're so secure in their superiority. And that is one of the core tenets of the X-Men, and it's something this series does so well. Like, there are things said by Graydon Creed in the 90s in a kids' cartoon show that people say nowadays, that are very, very strong allegories for things that people say nowadays, right-wing talking points that we see in the modern day. And it's made very clear that he is the bad guy. He is wrong. He is evil. And that is so good. So good to see that in something that's 30 years old. It's great when that stuff happens now. Although people cry it as too political. It's not political. What the X-Men is inherently political. You cannot escape that. X-Men is political. It is leftist. It is queer. It is socialist. It is fighting for equality is like the core part of the X-Men. It is fantastic. The X-Men are an allegory for minorities. Whatever minority you are, you are represented in the X-Men. And that is beautiful, like chef's kiss beautiful. It's one of many reasons why I'm drawn to them. It's one of many reasons why so many other people are drawn to them. And they are so inherently political, and to have that front and center in this animated series for kids is perfect. And, you know, as fun as just straight up evil villains like Mr. Sinister and Apocalypse are, having these more nuanced discussions with characters like Magneto, like conversations between Magneto and Xavier of like, you know, what's the right thing to do? How is the right way to approach intolerance? Do you approach it with violence, or do you try and approach it with understanding? You know, discussions that characters like Kelly and Creed and Trask have, you know, that is the core of this series. And so much of that is integral to the X-Men comics, integral to what Claremont and Byrne and Cockrum and all these other people that he's worked with throughout the years established as part of this core concept of the X-Men. And I love it. I bloody love it. And yeah, the series is so good. So good as a result, because yes, it's either adapting stories or telling its own unique stories, but at the same time, it's doing so much that's just lifted from the comics and is so true to what those comics are that it's beautiful, and I love it. So that's just the first 2 seasons. Where did it go from there? So, as I said, X-Men was probably one of the first times in an animated series that a full season of episodes flowed from one episode directly into the next one. And they did this with season 1, and they did this with season 2. And this was something that the producers fought very heavily for, to have these ongoing story arcs, to have these ongoing character developments throughout the series. And I think it was the biggest part of X-Men's early success. You know, the previously on X-Men became iconic because it caught you up on what the show was doing. Even if you saw these episodes out of order, you weren't lost. You could follow the story. Season 3, though, which was much bigger, it's 19 episodes as opposed to the 13 that the first 2 seasons had apiece. Season 3 is very different. Most of the episodes, with the exception of the multi-part stories, are kind of shown in a random order almost. And there were actually a lot of episodes for Season 3 that were created as part of Season 3, but then didn't air until Season 4 or even Season 5 in some cases, due to production issues. But Season 3 would also adapt possibly the most ambitious X-Men storyline. And that is the storyline, the Phoenix Saga. Now, Phoenix in the X-Men comics is very famous. It's a storyline that mainly centers around the character of Jean Grey, where she is... her mutant powers are enhanced to a almost cosmic level, turning her into the character Phoenix. Phoenix ends up taking the X-Men to Shi'ar space, where they deal with a a rogue alien emperor save an alien princess and stop a crystal from rewriting the universe, fighting a group of Shi'ar Imperial Guard who are essentially pastiches of DC's Legion of Superheroes in terms of their power sets. It's a group of aliens essentially that work for the Shi'ar Empire, led by Gladiator, who is basically Superman with a mohawk and purple skin. But that's only part of the Phoenix story. The Phoenix story in the comics starts roughly around issue 100. There's a 3-part story arc leading into X-Men issue 100, where the X-Men are abducted from New York on Christmas by Sentinels, taken into a space station. They're fought by an enemy of theirs called Stephen Lang. They manage to defeat him, and their space shuttle comes crashing back to Earth. And Jean pilots the ship through a cosmic storm, sacrificing herself for the rest of the X-Men to stay safe, along with the astronauts. The cosmic storm changes her. In the comics, the original idea was a cosmic storm is what gave the Fantastic Four their powers. What would happen if a mutant had the same effects on them? The Phoenix story was eventually retconned and revealed to be an alien intelligence that had actually possessed Jean Grey, and all sorts of other ridiculous changes that came in the following decades of continuity. But originally, Jean was to become Phoenix. She was then manipulated to become a Dark Phoenix. The Dark Phoenix saga is the most notable part of the story, but technically that doesn't come until later. That comes issue 129 to 139 of Uncanny X-Men. So a good couple of years after the original Phoenix saga. The original Phoenix saga is one of the earliest stories that Chris Claremont started work on. But like I said, Dark Phoenix is kind of more famous and has kind of overshadowed the original Phoenix saga. I think the original Phoenix saga is a very good cosmic romp, and once it happens, once the storyline happens, Jean remains Phoenix for a long time before she falls under the sway of a mutant called Mastermind and becomes the Dark Phoenix. So yeah, I like this storyline. And obviously it's a long story. And the series had already kind of made allusions to the Phoenix saga perhaps being in Jean's past already. And that the X-Men had maybe already dealt with it. However, no, they decided to actually deal with it properly. And so, yeah, we introduce the Shi'ar, we introduce the Phoenix, and a lot... In effect, the Phoenix saga and the Dark Phoenix saga take up 9 episodes of this season. And as I said, it's a 19-episode season. 5 of those episodes are the original Phoenix saga, or an adaptation thereof. It's not adaptation, sorry. Adaptation thereof. It's not completely one-to-one. Like Days of Future Past, there are changes made for the continuity that's already been established. But a lot of the main moments are there, including the introduction of the alien princess Lalandra, the use of the X-Man Banshee fighting against his cousin Black Tom, who's teamed up with the Juggernaut, the M-Crown Crystal, being seized by Mad Emperor D'Ken, and how Phoenix helps the X-Men to stop that. The introduction of the Starjammers, the leader of which is the human pirate Corsair, who is later revealed to be Cyclops' long-lost father, who was abducted when he was a child. Yeah, it's a very good story, and they even cover some other aspects of it, like a dark side of Xavier's consciousness, which is not something that was part of the original Phoenix Saga necessarily, but is part of, at least not as I remember, it is definitely part of Xavier's story, like the sort of dark, repressed side of his powers that, sort of runs wild and threatens the X-Men. And yeah, I think it's a very good adaptation. It appears in episodes 3 to 7 of this season, after the Shi'ar are set up in the opening two-parter Out of the Past, which features the character of Lady Deathstrike, who in this has been changed to be a former lover of Wolverine, which is a slight change to the character, although not a huge one. After that, there's a few other episodes, some of which pick up on plot threads from previous seasons, like we see the return of Archangel, who has now become obsessed with hunting down Apocalypse. We see the return of Longshot from the alien dimension Mojo world, Mojo having appeared in season 2, I believe it was. And I quite like Mojo. He's a lot of fun. He's basically an evil television executive. He's a lot of fun when he's written well, and the X-Men cartoon does quite a good version of him, with a very good performance from the voice actor. And so yeah, the series is continuing mythology, continues to build, but then it's revealed that one of the major changes for the Phoenix Saga in this is it's revealed quite early on that Phoenix is an alien possessing Jean's body. And this is mentioned by Xavier. Xavier sort of finds out and realizes that Phoenix is still inhabiting Jean's body and that Jean is starting to struggle. There's also a great episode, before I get into the Dark Phoenix Saga, featuring Iceman. Iceman comes in this. It's revealed that he's one of the original 5 X-Men, but he left due to his rebellious attitude. And this episode also kind of reveals that Angel was one of the original 5 as well, which obviously is true to the comics, but that hasn't been mentioned in any of Angel's previous appearances. So they just kind of skipped over that. And yeah, he's trying to find his girlfriend Lorna, who has left him, because she has joined a government-sponsored mutant team called X Factor, which is led by Forge, and also includes Cyclops' long-lost brother Alex, or Havoc. Although Havoc's identity is not revealed in this episode. But still, it's an interesting thing. Also, Quicksilver, I believe, is part of X Factor in this, because Quicksilver comes back in the next season as well. But yeah, the Dark Phoenix storyline is 4 episodes, and it takes place in episodes 14 through to 17, and it's only 4 parts, but each of these 4 parts is so tight to the original comic book plot of the Phoenix Saga. There are some changes, but there are also some scenes that are almost lifted from the panels, as if they took the panels as storyboards. And there are some changes and substitutions. For example, Rogue kind of takes the place of Colossus as kind of the super strong character. Beast sort of takes the place of Nightcrawler, who was on the comic team at the time. Gambit for Banshee, that sort of thing. But for the most part, this is the Phoenix Saga. it is the Dark Phoenix Saga. A group who in this called the Inner Circle Club, because Hellfire was apparently too risque for a children's show. Despite the fact they're all still dressed in, Emma Frost is still basically dressed in a corset and pants and stockings, as is Dark Phoenix herself when she becomes part of the club. Yeah, the mutant Jason Wingard, also known as Mastermind, he starts influencing Jean Grey, Phoenix, using his powers of illusion and using Emma Frost's telepathy. And, Phoenix starts to fall under his sway. And, the X-Men try to save Dazzler, who debuted, like I said earlier, in the original Dark Phoenix Saga, along with Kitty Pryde. Kitty Pryde, I should say, is the only X-Man who I think was a main X-Men character at the time, like a main serving member of the X-Men team, who doesn't appear in this show at all. And I think that might be linked to her role in Pride of the X-Men. Because obviously in that they were going to use her as the audience surrogate, which is also what the role that Jubilee was taking in this. But, the X-Men membership has ballooned in the 30 years since the original cartoon. But, yeah, pretty much every major X-Man from the team in the comics at that point appears as pretty much a major character in this. Nightcrawler gets a couple of episodes, Colossus gets a couple of episodes, Banshee appears in a few episodes, Forge appears in a few episodes, Dazzler, Longshot, Psylocke, I think it even appears towards the end as well. As in a relatively major role. Archangel, Iceman, all these important characters. Even Sunfire appears in a minor role. I think the only other major one who doesn't is Thunderbird, who is part of the second generation team who dies on their first mission. But his brother Warpath does appear in the series as kind of like a background character. Because that's another thing this show did really, really well, is it used a lot of background mutants that if you knew the comics, if you knew who these characters were, you found their presence welcome. If you didn't, then it was usually a cool costume or a cool power set for an action sequence. And so many characters appear in that way. From members of X-Force, members of the New Mutants, loads of random villains. And yeah, it's a lot of fun in that regard. But anyway, the Dark Phoenix Saga, the second part of the story involves the X-Men all being captured by the Circle Club and Phoenix being manipulated by Wingard to fight the X-Men. And, they manage to fight off the Inner Circle and get outside in Central Park. And that's where Phoenix is unleashed as the Dark Phoenix. She battles the X-Men in part 3. It leads her on a rampage. She defeats the team. And she flies off into space, and hungry, the Phoenix destroys a star, which explodes and destroys a whole planetary system, which is witnessed by a Shi'ar strike cruiser, which she then fights off and flies back to Earth. And the X-Men try and figure out a way to capture Jean and suppress the Phoenix and try and force Phoenix from her body without hurting her. There's lots of things where she's like begs Wolverine to end her because she can't control herself, and Wolverine can't because obviously he loves her. And then part 4 features Lilandra, who by now is the queen of the Shi'ar, revealing the destruction of this planetary system to the X-Men. What Dark Phoenix is guilty of. And they declare that the Dark Phoenix is the destroyer of legend and must die. And Xavier, using his knowledge of the Shi'ar, calls for a trial by combat. And so, on the blue area of the moon, which is something introduced in the comics, the Shi'ar Imperial Guard and the X-Men battle for the fate of Jean Grey. And it's fantastic. And these 4 episodes are solid. Like, if you want to experience the story of the Dark Phoenix saga and you're not really one for comics, you can't go wrong by watching these 4 episodes. These 4 episodes are so close to the comics. They get a story by credit for Chris Claremont and John Byrne. That's how close they are. They are incredible, absolutely perfect. There are lines from the comics, there are panels from the comics. It's a truncated version of the story. Like I said, the Dark Phoenix saga covers a lot of issues. Like, part 1 is loosely inspired by X-Men 130 to 132. Part 2 is basically X-Men 133 and 134. Part 3 is mainly 135 and 136. And then part 4 is X-Men 137, which is the end of the Phoenix Saga. So, those 8 issues cover the entirety of the story. And they're really, really good. Like, really good. They are solid. And like I said, if you're not one for comics, you can't really go wrong but to experience the story in this way, because it is pretty much perfect. The biggest changes from the original comics, besides the name of the Hellfire Club and obviously the makeup of the X-Men team, the biggest change from the comics are literally that the star system is empty when Dark Phoenix destroys it. In the comic books, it wasn't. In the comics, Dark Phoenix killed 5 billion people by destroying that star. And that is what she was sentenced to death for. And then the biggest change comes in the final moments. In the final moments, Jean manages to exert control over the Dark Phoenix and, realizing that the X-Men can't bring themselves to kill her, Cyclops and Wolverine can't bring themselves to do it, she takes control of a weapon on the moon and destroys herself. And this was something enforced by the editor at the time, Jim Shooter. Jim Shooter is a very controversial editor at Marvel Comics. He was a big part of their lineup during the early 80s. And like I said, he's a very controversial man. He was, a fan who made it into the industry. And he had a lot of big ideas. But I've got to admit, I quite like a lot of his decisions that he made. The comics produced by Marvel at this time, at the time that he was editor-in-chief, are really good. The guy knew his way around a story. He was good. He rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. A lot of top talent left Marvel Comics, and a lot of it went to the distinguished competition. People like Alan Moore, people like Marv Wolfman, who may not have made some of their biggest series at DC, like the New Teen Titans or Watchmen, Hellblazer, without Jim Shooter. But this was one of the decisions I think he was bang on the money with. He theorized, his opinion was that Jean could not simply be depowered. She could not, which was Chris Claremont's original plan. He wanted to depower Jean Grey completely, completely cut her off, and then explore that story leading into X-Men 150 and 200. Because by this point, Claremont had been writing for a while. He was not planning to go anywhere. He was planning the long game. And Jim Shooter turned around and said, no, she killed a whole planet. She killed 5 billion people. She has to die. And I think he was right. And she did. She stayed dead in the comics for a few years until Jim Shooter left the editor-in-chief position. Someone else took over. Someone else came up with an idea to bring Jean Grey back and to reveal that Phoenix wasn't Jean, and that Jean was actually in a cocoon under Jamaica Bay, which is where the space shuttle had crashed at the start of the whole thing. And yeah, I don't know. The whole bringing Jean back thing, I have thoughts on that that are completely separate. I will cover the X-Men at some point, and I'll probably discuss that then. But the biggest change in how that affects the cartoon is that in the cartoon, like I said, they knew that Phoenix was possessing Jean. And so Jean uses, this time not a weapon on the moon, but the Shi'ar cruiser in orbit to destroy herself. And that's when Phoenix comes out, sort of free of the influence of Dark Phoenix, because it turns out it was Jean's emotions that were corrupting her. So now that Jean is dead, Phoenix is sort of whole again and back to normal without that destructive influence. And Dark Phoenix takes part of the life force from all of the X-Men assembled, including Xavier, to restore Jean Grey to life. And it's explained that that means they'll all die younger than they would. Wolverine and Cyclops both offer to give the whole sacrifice, like to sacrifice their entire being to bring Jean back, which is very sweet. But yeah, I really like this story. I think it's, like I said, a fantastic adaptation across not just the final four, but even the first 5 episodes. Like, so much of the iconography, even with the changes made in the first 5 episodes, is still there. Like, the famous shot, which is the cover of X-Men 101, of Phoenix rising from Jamaica Bay, that's there. It's in the cartoon. She rises up and declares, "I am Phoenix," with the Firebird surrounding her. In the fantastic green and gold costume. It's there. The battle in the castle, which became memed in the "I'm the Juggernaut, bitch." That episode is where that comes from. Juggernaut smashing his way around a castle chasing the X-Men. It comes from Phoenix Saga Part 3, but you didn't know that. It's good. I really enjoy it. And then obviously, there's a couple of other episodes to finish the season, one of which has Cyclops and Corsair learn the truth about their relationship, which was a nice little epilogue to the Phoenix Saga, I thought. And then it goes into season 4 after a storyline featuring the Brood, not quite the Brood. The Brood are essentially the X-Men's answer to the Xenomorphs, because Chris Claremont was a huge sci-fi fan. And so, he came up with his own version of the Xenomorph, which is the Brood. And they kind of do an adaptation of that storyline as well. It's not a terrible adaptation, but yeah, they can't quite call them the Brood. So yeah, season 3 I think is definitely the most ambitious part of X-Men the Animated Series. This was a real attempt to, like I said, to adapt one of the biggest storylines in the comics and to adapt it so faithfully. You know, they'd done that, elements of that already, most notably Days of Future Past, which again is another big storyline. Days of Future Past appears only a few issues after the Phoenix Saga ends. It's issue 141 and 142 of Uncanny X-Men. And yet the Days of Future Past version that's used here is very different, because the Days of Future Past storyline was not the only time that future timeline appeared in the comics. It got revisited several times, most notably in the comic series Excalibur, but also a few other times since. And then, of course, by kind of merging that with Bishop's own future timeline, the Days of Future Past title, you know, episodes in season 1, while they adapted the present day elements of the Days of Future Past storyline from the comic, and some elements of the future timeline version, there were also elements of Bishop's story and a few other stories in there as well that all related to that universe. For example, the Super Sentinel Nimrod, who appears in subsequent versions with the character of Rachel Summers, who, again, another member of the X-Men. Actually, I'm not sure if Rachel appears in this series. I don't think she does. So that's another notable exception. She might appear as a background extra. But yeah, so, yeah, Nimrod is an advanced future Sentinel who's bright pink and metallic and has gone on to become a major X-Men villain, especially in the modern day. So he was, again, quite fun to see in adapting that storyline in a very different way. But the Phoenix Saga in this is done in such an honest, true to the comics way. You know, it's not cherry picking the best parts of multiple storylines, and it's not adapting the storyline to fit its own continuity. It's making that storyline work. It's making its continuity work with the storyline so that they can tell that storyline as accurately as possible. And for me, that works wonders. I suppose the good way to compare the X-Men animated series is to look at something like the MCU. The MCU, take for example something like Infinity War. Infinity War has elements of a lot of Thanos' stories from the comics, and I expect that Secret Wars, when we eventually get that, will do the same thing. But it is not a close adaptation of the original Infinity War story or even the original Infinity Gauntlet storyline. There's a lot of other elements in there as well. And that's kind of how a lot of season 1 and 2, especially, of the X-Men animated series worked. There was multiple elements from 30 years worth of continuity. Phoenix, it was literally the Phoenix Saga comics, and I think it worked so well as a result. So, how do you follow a season that has adapted one of the best comic book storylines for the characters that you're making a show about? Well, you carry on doing more of the same, and season 4, in a lot of ways, is a bit more similar to season 1 and 2. There's not as many direct adaptations of comic storylines, although there are still plenty of things inspired by the comics, and where relevant, there are plenty of story ideas that, you know, quite closely echo issues of the comic. Like, for example, there's a flashback episode called Xavier Remembers, which focuses on the first battle between Xavier and the Shadow King, which is mentioned in one of Claremont's more early issues of Uncanny X-Men. And, you know, there are parts of that are lifted almost directly. And, like, even the fact that Xavier, while walking around Cairo, has his pocket picked by a young Storm who grew up as a pickpocket in Cairo, you know, when she was an orphan. You know, just little touches that were introduced in the original comic that are still part of the series and this continuity of this series. But the thing is, the X-Men comics were still running, and they were still going very, very strongly. You know, by the time season 4 came out, it was 1995. And, you know, X-Men had recently had its 30th anniversary in the comics. I mentioned it earlier, the storyline Fatal Attractions. Fatal Attractions was a storyline featuring Magneto, his acolytes, which was this army that he'd gathered around him of fanatical mutant followers who believed in his promise of a better tomorrow. And it was literally Magneto declaring war almost, and trying to enact like his final end game. And the comic storyline for Fatal Attractions, while not terrible, it does suffer from some 90s excess. It's not as bad as some of the comics that followed it. Like, the original Fatal Attraction storyline is quite good. The art is quite good. The plotting is quite good. However, it was followed quite closely by an Avengers crossover called Blood Ties. You know, Avengers X-Men crossover, which was not very good. And that involved war on Genosha with the character, with the acolytes in the aftermath of Fatal Attractions. Did not like Blood Ties at all. You know, I liked it at the time, but going back and rereading it as an adult, it's pretty bad. However, Fatal Attractions is better than I give it credit for. There's some good moments in the comic, like the fact that Colossus, you know, broken-hearted by the recent death of his sister, his little sister Ileana, to the legacy virus, leaves the X-Men and joins the Acolytes. Or, you know, Magneto ripping the adamantium out of Wolverine's body forcibly, which then prompts Xavier to mind-wipe Magneto, which became a big foundational point leading into the next few years of storylines. But why am I bringing up Fatal Attractions? I'm bringing Fatal Attractions up because two of the earliest episodes in season 4 that weren't, you know, leftover episodes from season 3 were the storyline Sanctuary. And Sanctuary features the Acolytes, features Magneto's asteroid M, which is this orbiting asteroid that he's placed in space with a space station where he's declared that all mutants are welcome. And the leader of the Acolytes, Fabian Cortez, betrays Magneto and blames the X-Men, some of whom are on the station. And, you know, it's a fun little storyline, and, you know, it's inspired in part by Fatal Attractions, but also in part by Chris Claremont's final story, which I mentioned earlier, which was X-Men Volume 2, Issues 1 to 3, which again featured the Acolytes, featured Magneto, and featured the debut of Fabian Cortez. And Cortez is a trickster and a manipulator, and it's revealed that, like, one of the Acolytes used to be one of Xavier's former lovers, Amelia Vogt, and she helps the X-Men against Fabian and his madness. Yeah, it's a pretty solid adaptation. I can't hate it. You know, the episodes that follow introduce some more concepts. We see the return of Morph. We see the introduction of Nightcrawler. I love the character of Nightcrawler. He is my favorite X-Man. You know, the interesting dichotomy of someone who looks so devilish, but, you know, and looks so threatening, but he himself is this charming, fun-loving Christian swashbuckler. Love it. The episode Nightcrawler focuses more on the religious aspects of the character, because that is one of the easiest ways to introduce Nightcrawler, I think. X-Men 2 did the same thing when they introduced him, and they didn't really develop the swashbuckling side of the character, but I can't fault them for that. And, you know, Nightcrawler does have an effect. He has an effect upon, you know, Wolverine. He has an effect on Rogue as well, who also meets him. Rogue, Gambit, and Wolverine are in this episode. And yeah, it's a nice episode. Like I said, I like Nightcrawler. You know, it's a shame it takes so long into the series for him to appear. But then one of the more interesting episodes happens, which is the episode One Man's Worth. Now, One Man's Worth went on to actually inspire a comic book storyline. So this is sort of the opposite of the Phoenix Saga. The thing is, animated series take a long time to make, and especially ones that are ambitious. And X-Men, as much as Saban Entertainment got a reputation on Power Rangers for being notoriously cheap, they put some decent money into X-Men. And it shows, because if you compare the X-Men animated series to its Marvel contemporaries, so, like I said, this was 1995, Spider-Man started at the same time. Spider-Man started in 1995. Iron Man had already been and gone, so Fantastic Four and Incredible Hulk was on the TV. Hulk, Iron Man, and Spider-Man have, and Fantastic Four, have noticeably lower animation quality than X-Men. Despite the fact that they are introducing other elements. There's, for example, Spider-Man was quite prominent for some of its early CGI cityscapes that it used for New York. For better or worse, some of those have aged very badly. However, the animation quality is worse, and you can tell this because in the second season of Spider-Man, the X-Men appear. And they look radically different. The reason they look radically different is because the animation is worse. And by which I mean, I don't mean to say the animation in Spider-Man is bad. Spider-Man is a very, very good show. It's very well animated, as were a lot of the other series at the time. But the art style of X-Men is one that uses 3-color shading, right? So there is the main color, the shadowed color, and the highlight color. And you see this on all of the X-Men, all of the sets, the characters, everything, right? All the other Marvel series are animated in 2-color shading, especially Spider-Man. And it's also how the final few episodes, which were produced at a much cheaper budget, of X-Men would also look. You know, they use this 2-color shading. And it loses so much richness that makes the show look worse. You know, it'd be the equivalent of like one of the more noticeable shows that was another contemporary, animated contemporary of X-Men was the Batman animated series. Batman animated on black paper, and it used the black paper to create these big foreboding shadows. Everything looked dark, everything looked noir and kind of gothic and grim, and it works so well to punctuate Batman's world, right? Imagine what that show would have looked like if you'd animated it on white paper. That's the difference between the 3-color shading of X-Men and the 2-color shading of something like Spider-Man. It is a night and day difference. You can really see a difference in the quality. And I think it's one reason why X-Men has stood the test of time, despite the fact that there is, stock footage, there is, animation errors, there are, corners cut, and some bits can look cheap. I'm not saying the show cannot look bad. And, sometimes there's some episodes where actors are completely recast or vocal effects aren't used. Like, there's a couple of appearances of Apocalypse where he's not voiced by John Colicos. Like the episode Obsession I mentioned earlier in season 2 with Archangel. Or was it season 2 or season 3? The season 3 episode. And so... Or there's reappearances of the Sentinels in season 4 where they're not voiced by the original artist. They don't have the same vocal effects on, and it makes them sound worse. It makes Master Mold sound worse, for example. So there are definitely corners cut in some respects, but that richness of animation makes it pop. But anyway, I was talking about One Man's Worth. One Man's Worth was greenlit for this TV series in January 1994. Okay. This story then became the basis and inspiration for the crossover series Age of Apocalypse. Now, Age of Apocalypse was one of my favourite X-Men stories when I was a kid. I still really like it. I think it's a very solid story. Again, despite some of the 90s excess, because there are elements of it that are quite excessive. But it remains one of my favourite sort of dark universe, alternate, what-if stories. The concept is... the concept for One Man's Worth is that a villain from Bishop's future, Trevor Fitzroy, travels back in time, ordered by Master Mold to kill Professor X. And this creates an alternate present timeline where instead of, a war between, instead of the war that we had between the mutants and Sentinels, now there's a war between, Magneto's band of rebels, which features, Magneto, Forge, Nightcrawler, plenty of other characters like Sabretooth that we've seen, and Wolverine and Storm, who are now husband and wife, battling desperately against not just Sentinels, but other superheroes, like we see Giant Man from the Avengers. Bishop and his sister Shard arrive in this timeline after the time change, and they recruit Wolverine and Storm to help them go back in time and stop Fitzroy. They go back, and in part 1 they fail. They then do it again in part 2, and, they manage to go back and save Xavier. And before everything returns to normal, we get these nice touching moments between Wolverine and Storm as they say goodbye. And, yeah, it's a nice episode. It remains very character-focused in this. Focused on both the young Xavier and focused on Storm and Wolverine and their relationship in this alternate present. This then inspired the comic storyline Age of Apocalypse. Age of Apocalypse features a similar concept of Xavier being killed in the past and Magneto forming the resistance against an oppressive regime, except this time the oppressive regime is not the Sentinels, it is Apocalypse. And yeah, it's a very good storyline, and I will probably talk about it when I talk about X-Men, because, like I said, it's one of my favourites. I'm going to gush about it. but I strongly recommend, if you haven't, go and read it. It's a lot of fun. um, Essentially, the for this alternate timeline, they cancelled and replaced every X-Men title for 4 months, and they did 4-issue miniseries for these 4 months. Each book ended by, well, there was the giant Alpha issue, then were these 4-issue miniseries, which all interwove and featured different casts of characters, and then they culminated in an Omega issue, which sort of tied the storyline together. And yeah, I love it. There's some really epic moments in it, some very, very dark moments as well, and just shows, you know, how much better things are because of Xavier, and the effect he has, because the whole, yeah, the way he dies is through a previous story called Legion Quest. A character called Legion goes back in time to kill Magneto, so that Xavier's dream can become a reality. But he goes back to a time where he knows where Magneto is, which is when Xavier and Magneto are friends. And so Xavier jumps in the way of the Psyblast and dies instead. It's very good. Very good. Great storyline. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Age of Apocalypse. The reason it inspired Age of Apocalypse was because Bob Harris, who was supervisor of the X-Books in the 90s, the X-Books had their own, they were considered a group within Marvel, and each group on Marvel at the time had its own editor. And so Bob Harris was the editor of X-Men, in the same way there was an editor over Spider-Man, there was an editor over Avengers, etc. And, you know, not only was he group editor for the X-Men, he was also an advisor for the TV series, and he had full access to all the designs and story for One Man's Worth, and then decided to turn it into the Age of Apocalypse, and that followed. You know, he had those designs by May, and Age of Apocalypse came out about 8 months later. So, you know, it's very good. Another relatively recent storyline, which gets adapted in season 4, is the story Weapon X Lies in Videotape, which adapts the story The Shiva Scenario from Wolverine issue 48 to 50, which was written by Larry Hama, art by Mark Silvestri. There's also a bit of some later storylines from 1993 called from issue 61 to 64, where basically this is the episode Weapon X Lies in Videotape, which is essentially a photograph reveals a whole load of painful memories for Wolverine and begins to drive him insane. So to keep his mind safe, he travels to the one location that he thinks may hold the answers to his past, which is the Weapon X facility, where his bones were laced with adamantium. Now, Wolverine's origins in the comics have always been mysterious. And, you know, a lot of his history was sort of slowly drip released to us by Claremont. Claremont wrote him as a very mysterious character. It took the work of a lot of later artists and writers to sort of flesh out Wolverine, to flesh out exactly what happened at the Weapon X facility, how the adamantium got laced onto his bones, what that meant, which memories he had, what was false, what was true, his relationship to characters like Sabretooth, Maverick, his history in Japan, his history for the Canadian Secret Service. All of this was just added over the course of 15 or so years, between 1975 and 1990. The two most prominent additions, apart from the stories that I mentioned, which become the feed-in for this, was the original Weapon X Saga, which was published in Marvel Comics Presents, and was done by Barry Windsor Smith, and remains one of the goriest comics I think I've ever read. That isn't an adults only comic. It is. There are bits of it that are gruesome. Like there is dismemberment. There is lots of blood. It's done in a very 4-color pop art style, which makes everything pop. And Wolverine's running around naked, berserk, killing people left, right, and centre. So, which they actually adapted into the movies of X-Men Apocalypse for possibly X-Men Apocalypse's best scene. But yeah, this episode focuses on his relationships with the characters of Sabretooth, Maverick, and Silver Fox, who are all suffering quite similar breakdowns. And they find out that many of their actual memories were implanted, and a lot of their true memories had been destroyed with the lab. And, that they used to be a team for the Canadian Secret Service. They fought Omega Red, which is why he had such a history with Wolverine earlier on in the previous episodes that he appeared in. It's a good little adaptation. My one gripe with it is probably that Jubilee isn't a part of it, because she was a part of the comic storyline. But, a lot of these revelations, the history between Wolverine and Silver Fox, how they thought they were lovers, and then Sabretooth thought he'd killed her, and how it was all fake memories, it was all implanted. Or was it? Because, it pans out at the end of the episode and it reveals that there's a heart in a tree that says Logan and Silver Fox, or it's their initials in a tree, and in a love heart. And it's like there's some falseness there, but there's also something genuine there. And you're never quite clear on exactly what is what. And yeah, this was all a very relatively recent addition to the comic book mythos that, the X-Men series brought in and adapted in its own way. So not only have they tackled some of the biggest moments in X-Men history at this point, but they were starting to adapt ongoing stuff, new storylines that were being told. And this is as well as adapting, stories from long ago. Like season 4 also sees the adaptation of the Proteus storyline. Proteus is the son of Moira McTaggart. He's a reality warper, and he leaves to try and find his father. And there's other stuff that goes on with it. There's in the actual story adapted for the cartoon, he's not quite as mad and evil as he is in the comics. He also isn't killed like he is in the comics. The storyline in the comics takes place during the period between Phoenix and Dark Phoenix. As well. Like I said, there's about 20 or so issues between the two storylines, where 20 to 25 issues where a lot of stuff happens, including Jean thinking that the X-Men are dead for a while, which is how she falls under Wingard's spell in the comics, which is much more of a slow build in the comics than it was in the series. But they adapt that storyline, but they adapt it very well, because they make it about something relevant to children, because this is a children's show, and they use it to tackle the idea of divorce and being from a divorced family. They did similar things with a previous episode, and foster homing and being an orphan, which they did through Cyclops. in a previous episode where he went up against Zebediah Kilgrave, the Purple Man, the character most famously known being played by David Tennant in the Jessica Jones series. They also adapted, in the episode Family Ties, they adapted a storyline that reveals that Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch they are the children of Magneto. And, they have a connection to the High Evolutionary who was trying to keep them safe from Magneto because their mother came to him. So they adapt that. They reveal that Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch are Magneto's children. They do an episode called Bloodlines, which brings in Nightcrawler and reveals that Nightcrawler's birth mother is Mystique, who is also the foster mother of Rogue and also the birth mother of Graydon Creed. And so, we get some nice moments there that, again, develop Nightcrawler as a character, show, try and humanize Mystique a bit, bring back Graydon Creed, who hadn't been seen since season 2, and reveal just why he is the way he is. It's not just Sabretooth, it's also Mystique. And again, has a nice moral message between Nightcrawler and Mystique where he forgives her. And yeah, it's sweet, but not in a way that feels like it's talking down to the audience. It feels true to the characters. It's still, it's still in some elements a kid's storyline. A storyline that's appropriate for children, with a moral message that they can react to and recognise. And the idea that parents aren't perfect, they can be fallible, is a great one, I think, to teach kids. But I don't know, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. I think it's a really good way of telling these stories, to show these harsh truths and consequences in ways that don't talk down to children, in ways that are refreshingly honest and, like I said, true to the characters. Like, it never feels like any of these characters are different to their comic versions. There's a very strong theme on family running throughout the X-Men, in the comics and in the series. Very definitely a found family vibe, with the members of the X-Men themselves, but also, the familial ties between characters in this show, and their parental figures. Not just Nightcrawler and Rogue with Mystique, but also, Cyclops with Corsair. There's a good through line there, I think. That's, a Moira McTaggart with Proteus, and the anger he feels at her and his father. Yeah, I've kind of lost my train of thought a bit, so I apologise for that. I've gone on a bit of a ramble. But yeah, it's, like I said, it feels so refreshingly honest, and, like I said, feels true to these characters. It feels like it should, like it's right. And like I said, family is a theme of the X-Men that's very present, especially in the modern era, but throughout its run. This is a family, a found family. One of the good comparisons I saw is someone describing, it was a Tumblr post, it was a shit post, where someone basically said that, the Fantastic Four are a family, like an honest, true family. The Avengers are co-workers, the X-Men are a gang. And, they are a gang. They're a close-knit gang of friends that are bonded in a way that is so close to family. And I think this is why the X-Men resonate so well for minorities and queer people especially, because that whole concept of found family is something that is so true to the queer experience. Because a lot of queer people are not blessed to have family that fully supports them. And so they end up with a found family instead. And, that's true of the X-Men to a certain extent. They are ostracized from their families a lot of the time for being mutants. And so, the found family becomes very, very important. X-Men Season 4 culminates in a big story arc. They do a 4-part story arc at the end of Season 4, episodes 18 to 21. And it is called Beyond Good and Evil. Beyond Good and Evil was originally designed as the conclusion of the series. It is designed to tie every major ongoing plot thread together. It only introduces one really new character, which is the character of Psylocke, who's a psychic who confronts Archangel. But it brings in so many other previous characters. We see the return of Cable. We see the return of Bishop and his sister Shard. We see the X-Men, Mr. Sinister, Magneto, Mystique, Apocalypse, even Emma Frost from the Hellfire Club, even the Shi'ar. Essentially, what happens is Apocalypse, taking Cable's time device, arrives at the axis of time, and launches a plan to capture all of the psychics, all the psychic mutants and most powerful psychics around the history, and use their power at the axis of time to destroy all of time and then recreate the universe, a universe where he rules, and he will rule unchallenged. And, the X-Men, Cable, Archangel, Shard, they all team up to oppose him. There's time travel, there's all sorts going on. It is incredible. I love this episode. It is a great conclusion, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it. Obviously the X-Men win in the end, but there are so many great moments. Magneto and Mystique and Sinister are all working for Apocalypse, but obviously they don't all stay working for Apocalypse, shall we say. And it's good, and there's a lot of great cameos. There's a lot of psychics that you might recognise from the comics, not just X-Men comics, but, Marvel comics in general. And yeah, it's a great conclusion to the series that ends pretty much every major story arc. But then, of course, it didn't turn out to be the final episode, because while it was planned to be the ending, and it was planned to bring an end to the series and this epic conclusion and tie it all together, Fox decided to buy more episodes at the last minute. And, you know, they bought 10 new episodes for season 11. The first 4 are leftover two-parters that hadn't been finished. One of which is an adaptation of the, again, then recent comic book series, The Phalanx Covenant, which was a comic storyline from 1994. But again, it's kind of a loose adaptation because it also introduces other elements from the comics, such as the character of Warlock, who is one of the New Mutants, and, you know, a character who by the time of the Phalanx Covenant in the comics was long dead and had been replaced by another character called Douglock, who takes a more central role. Phalanx Covenant, I think, is another very, very good episode in terms of bringing in a lot of continuity. You see Beast and Warlock team up with Forge, Mr. Sinister, Amelia Vogt, and Magneto to oppose the Phalanx. Which I like. Yeah. It's a good one. I don't dislike it. I think it's almost an adaptation in name only of the Phalanx Covenant storyline, but there are enough elements from that original Phalanx Covenant storyline from the comics that I think it is accurate enough. The Phalanx Covenant storyline in the comics wove through all the X-Men books, and it was essentially split into 3 different story arcs. So X-Men and Uncanny X-Men dealt with one story arc, which was the founding of Generation X. They were protecting the newer generation of mutants from the Phalanx threat. X-Factor, Excalibur, and X-Force all teamed up together in a series called Life Signs, I believe. They were trying to get to the root of the Phalanx infection and trying to stop them from signaling the rest of the Phalanx in space. Using their control spire, which is an element of this cartoon adaptation. And then, of course, there was Wolverine, Cable, Jean, and Cyclops all teaming up together in the Wolverine and Cable series. Now, this cartoon features the same elements of it being a desperate struggle, that this is something that is affecting all mutants. You know, in the comics, it was mainly affecting the X-Men. It was all of the X-Men, as opposed to every mutant everywhere. But, you know, bringing in someone like Mr. Sinister helps kind of underline that this is more of a threat. But, you know, Quicksilver appears, Forge appears, you know, so we get to see X-Factor again. You know, the X-Men get captured, Quicksilver gets captured, some of the Acolytes get captured. I think Banshee gets captured because Amelia's working on Muir Island with Banshee and Moira, so Banshee gets captured. So, yeah, it fits as a kind of the desperate struggle. And again, by bringing in the character of Warlock and tying it to him and his own struggles with his race, who in the comics are the Technarchy, not the Phalanx. But the Phalanx and the Technarchy are related. Again, it's like the Days of Future Past adaptation earlier, where it's cherry-picking moments. And then, you know, you get the final 6 episodes. And the final 6 episodes, they're made a lot cheaper. A lot cheaper. Saban decided to produce them in-house rather than involving Gratz Entertainment. They hired a studio in the Philippines, which was simply called the Philippine Animation Studio, who worked on the 2nd season of Fantastic Four, because ACOM was unavailable due to other productions that they had in their pipeline. And they produced 6 episodes. The 5th Horseman, which sees the return of Fabian Cortez and his link to Apocalypse, which is sort of picking up from a plot thread in the aftermath of Sanctuary. A story featuring Wolverine and Captain America teaming up against the Red Skull, called Old Soldiers. That was quite a good one. And a very unconventional episode called Descent, which essentially revealed the origin of Mr. Sinister. Again, something that had only recently been revealed in comics at this point. It had been revealed in The Further Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, which I think was 1993, if not slightly afterwards. And in this, they kind of link Mr. Sinister to Charles Darwin and to Jack the Ripper and other sort of late 19th century figures. So, and, you know, an ancestor of Xavier is trying to stop him before he goes too far. It's a very unconventional episode. Doesn't really feature any of the X-Men at all. Like, Xavier's ancestor is voiced by the same actor as Xavier, but it's very unique. Very unique. And then the final episode, the very final episode, is called Graduation Day. You know, at a mutant human relations summit, Guy Ritchie attacks Xavier, and while the X-Men and Moira try to save him, Xavier is dying. And, you know, they try to contact the Shi'ar to come and save him, but they need Magneto's help to do it. Magneto is gathering a mutant army because of the, you know, the saber rattling by the humans. And, you know, he's gathering this mutant army on Genosha until the X-Men come to him and tell him that Xavier is dying, and he halts all of his plans for conquest out of respect for his only friend. And, you know, Xavier uses his powers to help the X-Men signal the Shi'ar. Lilandra comes, takes Xavier away to cure him, but it means that, you know, he has to go with her to the Shi'ar homeworld, and he might not come back. And then the final shot is Magneto and the X-Men, including Morph, outside the X-Mansion, saying goodbye to Xavier as he leaves with Lilandra and her ship. And despite the animation quality of this episode, it's a really good episode. It's a really well-written send-off for the show. And sort of, you know, bringing Magneto back and ending it with him on the side of the X-Men. Yeah, I really like it. And yeah, it just feels right. It feels like the X-Men, you know, they've lost their mentor, Magneto's lost his friend, but they found something together. And again, that ties it back to the sort of the found family thing. And, you know, it suggests that there's still issues between humans and mutants. Things aren't neat and tidy. And without Xavier, you know, we know the impact Xavier not being around can have through one man's worth. But it's still a hopeful, more optimistic ending than it could be. And I like it. Now, X-Men 92 was not the last adaptation of the X-Men. In fact, 2 further animated adaptations followed. X-Men 92 remains the longest running, or remained for a while anyway, the longest running X-Men, the longest running Marvel animated show. It was eventually superseded by Ultimate Spider-Man when it hit its 77th episode. But, you know, at 76 episodes, you know, X-Men 92 was a long-running show. Two major cartoons followed. The first was X-Men Evolution. This came about in the early 2000s, I believe. X-Men Evolution was a 4-season-long series that focused on the X-Men and Brotherhood as teenagers. And they attended not the Xavier Mansion, which was where they lived. They actually attended a local high school called Bayville. It's a lot better than it sounds from that premise. Now, it was a different cast. Wolverine and Storm, and later Beast, who was added in the second season, are older teachers at the mansion itself, mentors for the X-Men and helping them learn how to control their powers. The actual X-Men team was the students of Cyclops, Jean Grey, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, Rogue, who, true to her comic book version, was a member of the Brotherhood before joining the X-Men during season 1. And the brand new character of Spike, who is essentially an adaptation of the character Marrow from the comics, but also Storm's nephew for some reason. Spike ends up kind of being written out of the show towards the end, quite badly. I think he was added as an attempt at diversity, and I'm fine with that. The problem is, I don't think he was a great character. I think he was everyone's least favourite member. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood, like I said, get introduced. We have Toad, Blob, Quicksilver, Avalanche, and they are supervised by Mystique. And, you know, again, for the most part, it adapts a lot of... It doesn't directly adapt any stories. It more sort of incorporates them into its framework. You know, Juggernaut appears, and the Brotherhood and the X-Men team up to take him down. You know, they work together as Juggernaut starts rampaging through... Not even rampaging, he's just walking. He just literally escapes prison and starts walking towards the mansion. And because no one can stop him, you know... he just carries on waging through them. Magneto is revealed to be Mystique's backer, and he's revealed sort of towards the finale of the show. Finale of the first season. And I think there's some hint at a previous relationship between him and Xavier, but it's nothing like the quite well-developed relationship in X-Men 92. One of the things that X-Men Evolution was more notable for me especially, was bringing in the characters of the New Mutants. It did this by introducing a wider cast of students that sort of operated at the mansion as well. And there was Cannonball, Sunspot, Wolfsbane, Jubilee, Iceman, a character called Berserker, who was based on one of the Morlocks, and Magma, and I'm missing one more. I think it might have been Danny Moonstar. And obviously some of those are New Mutant characters, and some, like Iceman, are not. Eventually, mutants were secret throughout all this. Also, Kelly, Robert Kelly, I think it was actually Edward Kelly in this. He was the principal of the school. He took over in season 2 after Mystique disappeared, because Mystique was the principal first. And yeah, the New Mutants were quite interesting additions. A lot of them didn't get fleshed out until later. Like, mutants were outed, and then Jubilee and Wolfsbane disappeared. Like, their parents took them away from the mansion. But this then led to Cannonball, Sunspot, and Iceman, especially. And Boomer. They introduced Boomer as one of the New Mutants, and she got quite a lot of development. She was a lot of fun. Boomer, Boom Boom, I think is the code name they actually use for her. She's had several code names in the comics, from Boom Boom, Boomer, Meltdown. I think there's at least one more, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. But yeah, Boomer appears in this, and it's quite a faithful adaptation of her, so I was quite pleased to see that, because I do quite like Boomer, and I like her version in X-Men Evolution. X-Men Evolution also built up to a reveal of Apocalypse. It introduced characters like Gambit and Colossus and Pyro towards the end of its 3rd season. It also introduced the Scarlet Witch on the side of the Brotherhood. It had one episode which focused on the character Arcade, who is a great character. He's a games master, and he was manipulated by Mystique into taking control of the X-Men's Danger Room while the X-Men were in it, and he thought it was a video game, which was so much fun. It was a really fun episode that was in season 2. Season 4 was kind of shorter. It was kind of truncated. But, introduced the Morlocks. Spike ended up going through a mutation and ended up living with the Morlocks. One of the most famous additions to X-Men continuity that came from Evolution, though, was the character of X-23. X-23 is a clone of Wolverine, who is female and has a different claw arrangement. She has 1 claw on each foot and 2 claws on each hand. And obviously she was adapted into the movie Logan. She's the character Laura. She originated in X-Men Evolution. She was created for it, and she's great. She's a lot of fun. X-Men Evolution, like I said, it introduces Apocalypse. It sort of slowly builds to the reveal of Apocalypse, and then reveals him in the 4th or 5th season. I think the 5th season was like 5 episodes. So it's essentially like season 4 part 2. Apocalypse was originally introduced as this sort of floating god pharaoh before that wasn't particularly popular with fans, so they remade him and made him more of the traditional Apocalypse look. I didn't hate X-Men Evolution. To me, X-Men Evolution's best scene, though, is its final scene, which is a montage. After they beat Apocalypse, Xavier sort of sees the future, or thinks of the future anyway, and we see Magneto at the school teaching the New Mutants. We see Gambit and Colossus joining the X-Men team along with X-23. We see the Brotherhood becoming the Freedom Force, which was something that actually happened in the comics at one point. Mystique's Brotherhood of Mutants became a government-sponsored team to sort of... They preceded X-Factor, the government X-Factor led by Forge. As like government-sanctioned operatives, despite the fact they were the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. And that final scene, I think I have seen it on YouTube. It's very good. And this series also introduced Angel and actually made him cool as Angel without transforming him into Archangel. There's even one episode where Scott, Jean, Beast, and Iceman and Angel all team up. So we get the original 5 X-Men teamed up, and it makes that lineup cool. Because that lineup is not great. It's not the best X-Men lineup. I know it's a classic one, but it's not the best X-Men lineup. And yeah, this cartoon actually made it quite good. So like I said, X-Men Evolution doesn't directly adapt anything in the same way that X-Men 92 does, but it is pretty good. Another series that followed, which was only a season long, and this followed in the early 2010s. I can't remember exactly what year, because I think it was 2012, because I'm pretty sure it was cancelled as a result of the Marvel Disney buyout. And so we had season 1, but season 2 was never greenlit. And, instead we got Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, which I'm fine with. That show is great. But at the same time, so was this. And this season is Wolverine and the X-Men. Wolverine and the X-Men ran for 26 episodes. And it's a serialized storyline. In the opening 3 episodes, an attack happens on the mansion. The mansion explodes. Jean and Xavier are presumed missing. Meanwhile, Magneto is gathering his forces in Genosha, and a mutant control group and Sentinels are on the march. The X-Men have disbanded. Wolverine gathers them together to oppose the mutant control agency. And he gathers the X-Men back together, brings Rogue back from the Brotherhood because she's now gone back to them and joined them again. Again, characters like Nightcrawler, Kitty, Beast, Archangel, even Emma Frost, who is a member of the team. She'd been a member of the comics team for a while at this point. They all joined the new X-Men, along with Pyro and Forge and Iceman. And yeah, the 3-part opener kind of builds the team back up and reveals that Xavier is alive, but he's in a coma. However, they're able to communicate with him, and it turns out that Xavier's mind is actually in the future. And the future that he is in is the Days of Future Past future. And what follows is a very good season of storytelling that adapts a lot of, again, more recent X-Men ideas, while still building on Days of Future Past and featuring characters like Bishop in the future timeline, working with Xavier, and I think X-23 is in it as well. I think Marrow is there as one of the future X-Men, while also focusing on the modern day characters and the things in Genosha. And yeah, I really like this. It's a very focused series, and it was actually written by Chris Yost, who worked on the comics. He worked on X-Force quite famously, and I think he'd also worked on X-Men Evolution as well. And yeah, I really like Wolverine and the X-Men. I thought it was very, very good, but again, not directly adapting anything, just very inspired by stuff from the comics. The worst thing about Wolverine and the X-Men, though, is the fact that it ends on a cliffhanger. The 3-part finale reveals that the day the mansion was destroyed, it was actually Jean's Phoenix powers manifesting. And so, the final 3 parts features the return of Jean Grey as Dark Phoenix and does like a loose adaptation of that storyline. Emma sacrifices herself to sort of bring Jean back. And yeah, it's clever. It's a good ending. But then in the final moments, and this is the bit that annoys me so much about the fact that this got cancelled, in the final moments, it's revealed that Xavier is still in the future, but the future has changed, and it's no longer the Days of Future Past timeline. It's now the Age of Apocalypse timeline. And we see a final shot of Apocalypse on his pyramid, flanked by Mr. Sinister and the Age of Apocalypse version of Cyclops. And oh my god, I was so excited. And then it got cancelled. And yeah, I'm still mad about it, damn it. Because the thing is, production was underway on season 2. Like, scripts had been written, concept art had been made, characters had been designed. We were going to get accurate Age of Apocalypse versions of characters like Morph, Sabretooth, Sunfire, Magneto. Deadpool was going to be in it. And, you know, as well as all the modern day stuff, and some of the scripts have leaked online. Like, one of the first X-Men fan pages I followed when I joined Facebook was posting stuff from season 2 that someone behind the scenes had been able to get hold of. Yeah, great stuff. But again, neither of those are adaptations of the comics, not in the same way X-Men 92 is. There's only really one other thing that you could say adapted the X-Men comics in the same way that X-Men 92 did, that could possibly challenge X-Men 92 as an adaptation, and that's the X-Men film series. And again, the film series cherry picks elements of certain storylines, and some of them it adapts very, very well. X-Men 2, for example, is a pretty close analogy to the comic graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills, also by Chris Claremont. One of the best X-Men comics I think I've ever read, and is a very, very good graphic novel. I highly recommend it. But again, there are changes made. Stryker in X-Men 2 is an army general. He's not a fanatical preacher in the same way that he is in the comics. Ditto with something like Logan. While it's inspired by Old Man Logan from the comics, rather than adapting the travesty that is that storyline, I'm sorry, I know it has its fans. I hate Mark Millar's writing for Marvel. I think it is awful. The guy is such an edgy tryhard, and you can see it with things like Kick-Ass. And it means that his Marvel work is terrible. I know some of it is iconic, like Civil War and the Ultimates, but I hate it, and I really hate Old Man Logan. I think it's the worst example of his work, despite some great ideas. Like, you know, Wolverine being manipulated into killing the X-Men, and as a result refusing to unsheath his claws. Great idea. The fact that it's Mysterio that does it, the fact that it's how it's done, no, makes no sense. And then, of course, then all the other edgy elements that are thrown in, like Spider Bitch and the inbred Hulk family. No, hate it. Glad none of that made it into Logan, because Logan is a perfect movie. Like, Logan is solid as a film. It's not my favourite X-Men film. I think my favourite X-Men film is probably Days of Future Past. But I would agree that Logan is the best made film in the X-Men film franchise. But yeah, I think Days of Future Past is my favourite. Again, Days of Future Past, though, not a complete one-to-one adaptation of the original story. more close to the original story in some respects than even X-Men 92 was in some respects, but still very, very different. And in fact, in some ways, probably even inspired by the X-Men 92 series, like Bishop having quite a prominent role in as one of the future mutants, quite possibly inspired by the cartoons, both X-Men 92 and Wolverine and the X-Men, where he had that same role. But, you know, again, Mystique was a prominent element. Kitty was a prominent element. So, yeah, there's a lot of similar elements. One of the biggest criticisms, though, which I have around the X-Men film franchise, surrounds the character of Wolverine. Now, don't get me wrong, I really like Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. He's not perfect. He's not quite the Wolverine from the comics. Like, back in the 90s, when it was originally planned to do an X-Men film, the actor that they were eyeing to play Wolverine, who I think would have been perfect in the role based on the comic book portrayal of Wolverine, was Bob Hoskins. And, you know, he could have done that role fantastically. He really could. But, you know, Hugh Jackman's take on Wolverine is a very different beast to what Wolverine is in the comics. Hugh Jackman's Wolverine, as he is written and as he is portrayed, you know, being played by Hugh Jackman, who is a stunningly good-looking man, as well. He is a leading man. He is a lead character. He's the focal character. He's a protagonist. Even in the X-Men team movies. Now, and again, Wolverine is the protagonist of Wolverine and the X-Men, which I've already said is a great show and one of my favourite adaptations of the comics. I think it's brilliant. I do recommend watching Wolverine and the X-Men if you get a chance. You probably have to pirate it. I don't think it's on anything legal. It's not on Disney Plus here in the UK. I'm not sure about abroad. I think it might be in America. But I don't know where it is here. I don't think it's actually on anything. And obviously Wolverine has a focal role in that. But Wolverine's role in that becomes a mentor figure rather than a protagonist. In the films, he is a protagonist. This is one reason why I like Days of Future Past. Days of Future Past, he takes on a more mentor role to the young Xavier and to Beast. The film is very much still focused on Xavier and Magneto. You know, their relationship from X-Men First Class being one of the strongest aspects of that newer version of the cast. And obviously Mystique gets quite a prominent role as well. You know, say what you want about Jennifer Lawrence's portrayal as Mystique. It's a good adaptation of the character, especially in that film. Subsequent ones, not so much, but in Days of Future Past, I think it's done very, very well. But Hugh Jackman is done as a leading man, which means he gets the majority of the focus. Like, he is the point of view character for the first X-Men movie. He gets a prominent part of the screen time and story in the second X-Men movie. He quickly supersedes Cyclops as Jean Grey's main love interest and leader of the team in X-Men 3, The Last Stand. He then gets his own trilogy of movies, and like I said, I like Logan. I think Wolverine as well is very, very good, like The Wolverine. It's a very good adaptation of the first Wolverine miniseries. Kind of falls apart in Act 3, but Act 1 and 2 are pretty much solid. You know, the issue I have with Act 3 is mainly the Silver Samurai. It's a giant CGI boss fight. And yeah, I could do without it. Everything up until then, very, very, very good, very interesting, a lot of fun. Like, some great action sequences. The fight on the bullet train is brilliant. Yukio is great. X-Men Origins Wolverine, though, that is awful. Stay away from that movie. It is terrible. Just do not own it. Throw it in a dumpster fire. It is not worth your time. Even with Dominic Monaghan in it, and Ryan Reynolds. It's terrible. Do not watch it. Although Liev Schreiber as Sabretooth is great in it. Like, he is the movie's one redeeming quality. He is fantastic. As is Taylor Kitsch as Gambit, actually. He's quite good. But yeah, they're not enough to save the movie. And then, of course, like I said, in the newer X-Men films, they focused, from First Class onwards, they focused more on Xavier, Magneto, and Mystique. But still, Wolverine is a part of Days of Future Past. I think he's handled very well there in that he doesn't overshadow the others. But he still has to be part of it. He has to have a large extended cameo in X-Men Apocalypse. Which again adapts the Weapon X stuff, which we'd already kind of seen in the old timeline of the X-Men universe. Don't get me started on the timelines of the X-Men film series. That's a whole other nightmare. And, we're getting him back in Deadpool 3, or Deadpool and Wolverine, or Wolverine and Deadpool, however it's going to be referred to. And I'm happy for that. Despite the beautiful ending that Logan was for the character, I'm still going to be happy to see him again. But I don't need it. I don't need Wolverine to have that huge of a role. And I think this was one of the elements where X-Men 92 shined. Don't get me wrong, Wolverine he has been the X-Man with the longest running solo title. He's not the first of the X-Men to get a solo title. That was actually Iceman, and Nightcrawler also got a solo title before Wolverine as well, I think. Or just after Wolverine. But Wolverine was the first one to have a solo ongoing title rather than just a limited series. And it's been running pretty much since the late 70s, early 80s. And Wolverine still gets his own solo adventures. He is a popular character, and part of that has been the mystique that was built up around him and who he was and his history, although a lot of that has been revealed in recent years. And, there's definitely solo stories that you can tell. And even in season 1, there was an episode where they took Wolverine away from the team and gave him a solo story. But when Wolverine is part of the X-Men in X-Men 92, when it's an episode that focuses on Wolverine as part of the team, he doesn't overshadow the others. He is a team player. He's definitely one of the best characters on the team, but other characters get moments to shine, whether it's Gambit, whether it's Beast, Rogue, Storm, Jubilee, Cyclops. They all get moments to shine, not just Wolverine. And that is brilliant. That's exactly how it should be. And that, to me, is one of many, many, many reasons, as I've discussed throughout this episode, why, for me, X-Men 92 is the best X-Men adaptation. The best adaptation of those comics. Because it is so true to the characters and what those comics are. In a way that the films weren't, the subsequent cartoons weren't. all of the weirdness, all of the bizarreness from those comics is represented in X-Men 92. You know, the Savage Land, the Shi'ar, Mojo, the Brood, it's all there. As well as everything else that everyone would expect, like Magneto and Charles's relationship, Mr. Sinister, Apocalypse, Wolverine's history with Weapon X, you know, the love triangle with Cyclops, Jean, and Wolverine, you know, the will they, won't they romance between Gambit and Rogue, the time travel stuff with Bishop and Cable, and the Sentinels, the human mutant racial tension, everything is there, and it is perfect. And it is one reason why X-Men 92 still holds up 30 years later, and one of many reasons why Disney is bringing it back. You know, Disney aren't just bringing this back because it's what, you know, because it's what the fans want. You know, a lot of fans, we hadn't asked for this. We hadn't expected this. But we're getting it because it's the best way to revitalize what the X-Men are and bring that back into the modern day. Everything that the X-Men are. As good as the film series was, and, you know, its 20-year history as a film series from 2000 up until 2019 when Dark Phoenix released. You know, those films got an ignominious end, I should say. When the Fox buyout happened, there were plans. They were planning to bring in Mr. Sinister. They were planning to tie together Deadpool, the New Mutants, Laura from Logan, and the 90s, you know, the prequel versions of those characters. They were planning to tie them all together against Mr. Sinister. I was so on board for that. They were going to bring in Gambit. They were going to do an adaptation of a storyline where Kitty Pryde is evading a demon throughout the house. You know, even New Mutants. New Mutants wasn't terrible. I will stand up for that film. I quite liked it. It was good. You know, it wasn't great. That was the thing. Everyone built their hopes on it and thinking, oh, this will be good because it's been saved for so long. No, it was just good. If it hadn't released as one of the last X-Men movies, people wouldn't judge it anywhere near as harshly as they do. Dark Phoenix, however, Dark Phoenix is not great. It makes all the same mistakes with that storyline that X-Men 3 did, but worse. But New Mutants was pretty good. And, you know, the X-Men film series is like that. It's peaks and troughs of middling quality, but also all very grounded and very pedestrian compared to what the comics are. X-Men 92 is none of that. The quality is there throughout, and it is very good. Even in the worst episodes, those horrible, cheap-looking episodes right at the end, the voice quality is there. The story quality is there. The animation isn't, but everything else is. And it's still there. It's why Graduation Day, the final episode, is still as good as it is. You know? Other episodes are better, like Beyond Good and Evil is a much better conclusion than Graduation Day, but Graduation Day is still good. And I'm excited to see X-Men come back. I'm excited for X-Men 97. The concept art they revealed at Comic-Con was amazing. All these characters are coming back. They look almost exactly the same. I think Storm's got a new haircut, but apart from that, they all look exactly the same. They showed concept art for Nightcrawler, Morph, Forge, Cable, so they're all coming back as well. Mr. Sinister, Emma Frost, so they're all coming back. And Magneto's leading the team against Sentinels. I don't know how they're going to do it. I don't know if they're going to serialize it. I don't know how many episodes it's going to have. I don't know if it's going to have a format like What If or like some of the other Disney Plus Marvel shows. To be honest, I don't care. I am just excited that X-Men is coming back. and I'm really looking forward to it. So, once again, thank you everyone for listening. I think I've made a pretty good case as to why I think X-Men is the best adaptation. I did ramble a fair few times. X-Men is one of my favourite things. I grew up reading these comics. I've been reading the X-Men for a long time. I think the only comic I've read for longer than the X-Men has been Sonic. So yeah, they mean a lot to me. These characters mean a lot to me. These storylines mean a lot to me. And I've read most of their major storylines, or at least know what happened in them. And so, and the X-Men have had a lot of storylines. So, yeah, the X-Men to me are like the equivalent of like my first sports team. They're the first real love. The first thing I really supported. And, I always felt kind of disappointed by the films in that, they had this varying quality. They had issues with their adaptation. They never felt to me like they captured the magic of what the comics were. And it was going back recently and rewatching X-Men 92, which I had seen so much of back in the day, but actually rewatching it with fresh eyes and watching it with my kids as well. One of my sons got very into it, and so we had to sit and watch it together, and realizing and remembering just how good it was and how much of those comics is there. So much of it is there, and for me that's brilliant. And I'm really looking forward to X-Men 97. As I said, I think it's going to be, I think it has the potential to be incredible. Most of the original cast are returning. Not all of them in the same roles. Alison Court, for example, has said that she will not, while she returns to the series, she is not going to be returning as Jubilee. She feels it's more appropriate for an actress of Asian descent to voice Jubilee, which I agree with. She's obviously the actor who played Charles Xavier will not be returning. He passed away. The same for the actor who, John Colicos. I don't know if they're going to be bringing back Apocalypse immediately, but obviously John Colicos passed a few years ago. I don't think they're the only ones. I think a few other members of the cast have passed away. But for the most part, all of the others are going to be voiced by their original actors. Lenore Zan, Cathal Dodd, and those are the actors that I hear when I read these characters in the comics. I don't hear Hugh Jackman or Anna Paquin or Kelsey Grammer, or Patrick Stewart maybe. I hear these characters, these actors as the X-Men, and I probably always will. And it's because of this show and the effect this show had on me and how well it adapts these stories. And if you've never seen X-Men 92, I highly recommend it. Season 1 especially is a great adaptation of some of the more outlandish concepts in the X-Men and brings in some of the so many concepts and characters, but in a way that's very good. As I said, the adaptation of the Dark Phoenix saga in season 3 is solid, so solid. It's absolutely incredible. To the point it's like watching a motion comic sometimes. And then, if you have if you have watched the series and you have gotten into it, you can't go wrong by finishing Beyond Good and Evil and, watching every plot line that is built up culminate in that amazing storyline. So yeah, I really recommend X-Men if you've not seen it. Now, obviously this episode was delayed. I meant to get this out a lot earlier. I have other episodes that I'm still working on, still finishing off, but they are hopefully going to be dropping very soon. Hopefully within a few days of this one going up. And hopefully I can get them all out in very short order. So we'll get this one out for now, and fingers crossed I can get back to some sort of a schedule around here. That would be lovely. In the meantime, my friends, you all look after yourself, you look after your mental health, take care of yourself, take time to do what you enjoy. That's, I think, so important. If you don't take time to enjoy what you enjoy, if you're just moving from work to home and or work to sleep, and what are you living for? You have to live for yourself, live for the things that you enjoy, whatever that might be. Look after yourselves, guys. Until next time. Thank you, my friends, for once again joining me on Garhdo Goes Geek. Your continued support for this podcast means the absolute world to me, and I am grateful for every single one of you who stays and listens to one of my episodes. It means the absolute world. Now, if you would like to engage more with me or the podcast, we have a Discord community, small but growing, and we now have commissions open on Ko-Fi. So if there's a topic you would like to see me cover, you can pay me to cover it. All funds will be used for legal purchase of the relevant items where I do not have them. Have a look on the link tree for more information. Until next time, look after yourselves.